replaced men, which was not the point. It was matrilineal. But women did control their own fertility, and the idea that patriarchy decided when and whether women should have children to whom those children belonged had not yet come along. And that not yet was only on this continent 500 or 600 years ago, nowhere in the world maybe more than 5,000 years ago. So for 95% of human history, we live differently. And somehow that gives me hope. You know, I think that the idea that what we are seeing as human nature is the most oppressive, that there is no choice. In fact, there is choice, and there's choice in different kinds of cultures we can learn about. And why did all this violence come about? Gradually, to control reproduction. If women's bodies were not the most basic means of production, the means of reproduction, this would not be happening. In order to control how many workers, how many soldiers, who they belong to in patriarchal systems, in order to continue racist structures, you have to be able to influence what groups continue and what do not. So women of the so-called superior group are isolated, so they will keep the superior group pure. And women of the so-called inferior group are exploited, so they will produce more people marked on their skins as cheap labor. I think the intertwining of racism and sexism is so clear. I think we know it. And yet, our movements are still sometimes thought of as separate or in silos, when in fact it's not possible to be a feminist and not be an anti-racist, and it's not possible to defeat racism without also attacking sexism. It's simply not possible. Of course, there is also a division sometimes between us and between the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement, which also makes no sense. Sometimes on campuses where I speak a lot, young people will say to me, why is it that the same groups are against birth control and lesbians? But obviously it makes sense, because the same groups are against any form of sexual expression that cannot end in conception. So naturally, they're against women's ability to control our own reproductive lives and decide whether and when to have children, which incidentally is the single greatest element in whether we're healthy or not, educated or not, working outside the home or not, and how long we live. It's our health concern to achieve reproductive freedom as a fundamental human right, like freedom of speech. And love between two women or between two men stands for the fact that human sexuality has never been only about procreation. It's always been about bonding and reaching out to each other and expressing love and caring. So throughout history, our adversaries have been the same. Our adversaries understand why our movements are interlocked, and we need to understand why our movements are interlocked. I think that the most startling confirmation I've had lately, which I would like to share with you, is from a newly published book called Sex and World Peace by Valerie Hudson and other scholars. It was published by the Columbia University Press, and I commend it to you. We've always known that in early societies and original societies, the polarization of gender roles was the indicator of violence. We've known that, but What these scholars have managed to do in a very readable and irresistible way is to take 100 modern societies and show with endless amounts of irrefutable information that the single greatest indicator of whether a country is violent internally, as violent in its streets, violence in its way of life, so on, and is militarily violent towards its neighbors, is not whether the country is poor or not whether it is struggling for natural resources or not what its religion is, and not even its degree of democracy. It is the degree of violence against females. That is the most reliable indicator. Whether it is female infanticide and honor killings, or domestic violence and sexual assault as it is for us, that is the single greatest indicator. Yet where is that in our foreign policies in our nations? Where is that as a profound, deep understanding that violence against women, violence against females, is what we experience the earliest in the family, what normalizes the idea of dominance and violence, what makes us think it's inevitable, and even that it's human nature. I hope that this new understanding will help us to understand, to realize how crucial it is that we see the family as the microcosm of the world. If we don't have democratic families, it's much more difficult to build a democratic world. If we have violence in the household, it's much more difficult to understand, to heal, to realize that violence is not inevitable, that it is not, that men do not have to earn their masculinity by being in control, that women do not have to earn their femininity by being controlled. It goes very, very deep, and yet we don't